Okay, here on the Family Brand podcast today, I have a guest that I wanted to have for a long time. I'm so excited to have Jennifer Finlayson Fife. Thank you for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, on Family Brand podcast, we talk a lot about any subject that will build and strengthen families. And today that subject looks like marriage, specifically sex in marriage. And I look to you as the authority, at least in my mind, on this subject. So we've never had this subject on the podcast before. So I'm really looking forward to learning and sharing with the audience everything that I've learned from you. And I know I'm going to learn more today. So kind of history is I went to Jennifer's she does in-person workshops, online courses. We'll get into that later, but I went to a retreat in September with a couple of girlfriends, and it was such a great experience. I've been to a lot of personal development things, and I left your workshop feeling like, wow, that was maybe the best workshop I've ever been to. It was so good. So exciting.
I'm so glad.
And you just created such a beautiful space for, this one was just women to come share their experience and learn more about themselves and their sexuality. And anyway, it was just so good. And I wanted to bring that here.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. I'm glad you were there, and I'm glad it was such a good experience.
Yes. Okay. So jumping right in, what had you pursue? You're a relationship and sexuality coach. What had you pursue a career in that field? Such an interesting career.
Yeah. Yeah. I never would have thought it when I was a kid. So I knew at a young age that I cared a lot about the question of what made people happy, and also what made people be happily married. And I don't know why I was fascinated with that question, but I was. And I grew up as a Latter-day Saint, and there was a lot of in my faith, there was a lot of focus on the importance of marriage and the value of marriage. But I also saw often that there were women that were not happy, or that there seemed like there was this sort of disconnect between our ideal and how happily married people were. It wasn't, I was more attuned into the women, I think, but I think I could see that couples were often didn't seem happy to me. So I think I just cared about that question. And I ended up, after I graduated from college, deciding to pursue a Ph.D. So I got my Ph.D. in counseling psychology. But I wrote my dissertation on Mormon women or LDS women's experience premaritally and transitioning into marriage, around specifically the question of basically women's sense of agency in their sexual relationships. And what I mean by agency is this sense that you're an actor in your life, that you can create the reality that you want, because a lot of women, whether religious or not, often hear the messages that they should conform to the desires of others, that they should sort of give up their wants and their hopes. And there's a lot of value in some respects in this idea, especially if you're parenting and raising children, is that to do it well is often to forsake other ideals, other capacities, other dreams for the benefit of rearing your children well. But a lot of times, I was interested in when this would almost take on a level of, to be good is to self-sacrifice always, like to let go of your desires, to be needless and wantless in a sense. And most particularly around sexuality, like the really good woman is not that interested in sex. So my dissertation then brought me into the topic area of sexuality. And so that's how I do the work I do, which is primarily, I used to do mental health counseling. Now I'm primarily just doing coaching and instruction, online courses, live workshops where I'm working with men, women, and couples around how to create more intimate marriages.
Yes, I love that. And that's that's exactly, what I want to get into today. How important is a fulfilling sexual relationship in a marriage?
Well, it depends a little bit on what one's expectations are of marriage. So that is to say, if people, probably when they were out on the frontier, the primary goal of marriage was survival for that. So maybe it was less important in a marriage that was much more pragmatic and functional. In our day and age, we have much higher expectations of marriage. And I think there's a lot of value in that fact, because that is that we expect the marriage to fulfill us at a higher level, or to create something much more intimate and rewarding. Now, marriage doesn't have to be that, but the challenge is that most of us desire that and anticipate that. And when it's not there, oftentimes we are the problem on some level, because we're not prepared for what an intimate marriage actually requires. And so when you want it and you're not getting it, it can really erode the foundation of a marriage. And so learning what it is to create more friendship, create more of a sense of friendship within the marriage is really critical for being happy.
I read I've been reading a book by Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People. And I realized that there's, in the recent publications, there's a whole section left out that was originally, it was like how to find happiness in family, or find happiness at home. And I found online like the original version, and one of his chapters in that section is actually all about sex. He calls it something different, but there's this quote in there that I wanted to read and get your opinion on. So this was published in like 1936. And he says, sex, says the famous psychologist John B. Watson, is admittedly the most important subject in life. It is admittedly the thing which causes the most shipwrecks in the happiness of men and women. And I've heard a number of practicing physicians in speeches before my own classes say practically the same thing. Isn't it pitiful then that in the 20th century, with all of our books and all of our education, marriages should be destroyed and lives wrecked by ignorance concerning this most primal and natural instinct?
Yeah. That's interesting they took it out.
I know, I thought so too. Do you in your work, do you find that this I forget what he calls it in this chapter, but basically if there's these sexual issues coming up, that oftentimes is a big challenge in marriage, people coming to you, like how much does it impact a marriage if they're having these difficult?
It impacts it a lot. There was some research done, I think, by I can't say his first name right now, McCarthy something, Brian or something, can't remember his first name, sorry, but he did some research on it's something like, if the sexual relationship is not going well, it accounts for 80% of the unhappiness in the marriage. Maybe it was like 60%, but it's more than half.
A lot, yeah.
And if it is going well, it accounts for 20% of the happiness. So it has this like stronger negative effect than it does a positive effect on the overall understanding of what makes the marriage happy. So, marriage is a sexual agreement. It starts out, through sexual attraction, at least in modern marriage. It's not arranged. It's not just pragmatic anymore. It's saying, of all the people I could partner with, I desire you. I choose you. I want to bring my sexuality to you. And so a lot of us start out under that assumption. But then if for whatever reasons, because of anxieties around sex or difficulty with closeness or issues in the marriage, it's not happening, well, people take it personally, mostly because it's connected to desire. Do you desire me? Do you find me attractive? Do you want to be close to me? And if the answer is no, evidenced by a lack of sex in the marriage, it really erodes the foundation. It really crumbles the integrity of the marriage, because this foundational question is, I don't want you. Yeah.
That kind of leads me where I wanted to go next. I feel like usually I do this podcast with Chris, so the audience knows Chris and I. And I just feel like as we've as we've gone through our journey of marriage, we were each other's first, we were taught abstinence before marriage. We were each other's first sexual partner. It's been such an evolution, and a learning curve in many instances of what sexual fulfillment and connection looks like. And I've seen it change. When we were first married, the challenges were different than they were, when we had a bunch of little kids and things. And I would love to, for our listeners, I feel like I would have loved to have shortened the learning curve. Like when we were like in the trenches that like first, and I don't want to make it sound like, oh, we've, evolved
got it all worked out.
All of it. Yeah, I've got it all worked out. But I just like to walk through a few of these phases of marriage and the specific challenges that I think they bring in. Would love for you to speak to them. Like, maybe starting out like at the beginning of a marriage, like what challenges do you see in marriages, like regarding sexuality at that?
Well, the population I work with is often marrying with little or no sexual experience. So there are challenges that are just sometimes out of the gate around what does it mean for me to be a sexual person? So there's often questions around, is it okay for me to be sexual, for men and women sometimes? Is it, something destructive or evil? Is it something kind of ungodly in a sense, or I'm trying to think of a neutral word, but like, is it something that good people don't do? So I think there's questions around that. There's often questions around gender roles, like a lot of women learn that they should sort of be there for a man's needs. And so a lot of those meanings, even if people didn't have much awareness of them, shaping them, they're often there shaping how they start to do marriage, whether or not they realize it. A lot of times when you're dating, sexual desire is happening to you, but when you move into marriage, it's not as exciting. I can say a little bit about that, but like when you're dating, there's so much uncertainty and there's so much novelty, and there's just all this element of anticipation and the potential for good things to come, and that all creates desire. But then when people get married, oftentimes it moves from anticipation and a kind of exciting kind of uncertainty into expectation and and duty, and you owe me, and what about my needs, and it turns into that. And so desire often goes down. And then people often feel like, well, is it okay for me to do things that create desire in me? Because that makes me not a good person, right? To think sexual thoughts or to, cultivate sexual feelings. So that's some of the early challenges around who are we as a couple? Who am I as a person? And what do I think about sexuality? And how are we going to negotiate this as a couple?
And you went into this a lot deeper, of course, than the Art of Desire workshop is that I attended. And just, things and confronting some of those things that you have held to be true, and realizing like, are these true? Are these beliefs that I've had ones that I want to continue holding on to, or should I look at?
Absolutely. So a lot of the work I do is helping women and men, because I have a course for men too, but look at the inherited messages often around what it is to be a good woman, what it is to be a good man, what it is. A lot of women see a drop upon becoming mothers because they have a narrative that a good mother is selfless. She forsakes things. And if a mother shouldn't be sexy. And this is not like they are saying this to themselves. It's just kind of an idea that they've inherited and internalized, and then are just unwittingly living it out. And so it's easy, not only is it busy when you become a parent and a little overwhelming, and you're kind of losing a sense of yourself in other domains often, but then there can be this added idea that we should, that our sexual relationship, our partnership should be secondary to the kids. And a lot of times it becomes a distant second because of this anxiety that sexuality will interfere with being a good parent. So yeah, so a lot of the work I do is helping people to see the messages that they've internalized and how it's shaped their choices and their sense of freedom in their lives and in their marriages. Because sexual desire is highly related to a sense of freedom in your life. And so if you have created a relationship to your spouse and yourself that is too constrictive, it's very hard to feel desire.
How would you, if you are maybe in a marriage right now where it is, maybe you do have a lot of little babies, you are busy, how would you create less constriction and more desire?
Well, I tend to think of it from two levels. The first is just like the pure logistical element of it, that when you're all hands on deck and you're completely overwhelmed and you're like 24/7 being a parent, it's literally valuable for the marriage and for your mental health to have a break, like a night you go out, a night you go do something else with your spouse, with friends, that you're planning in breaks. Like any job, no matter how phenomenal, to do it 24/7 week after week, you get burnt out.
Yes.
Right. So everybody needs a break, and everybody needs a reminder that they're not just a parent, that they're also a person, a woman, a partner. And so the logistical of just creating space for it, even when it feels perhaps trivial compared to the more pressing demands of young children, is just really critical for keeping some space or some sense of who you are outside of this important role. The other factor, though, is really thinking about the way people do marriage or the way they're doing parenthood, because some people know that this is an intensive time, but I have these other gifts and abilities and possibilities, but for right now, I'm putting them aside or backburnering them for this more intensive period of raising children, but I know it's temporary. And that's very different than somebody who says, my desires, my feelings, and so on aren't that important, and I should sacrifice for my husband, for my children, for everybody else. That's a different reality. So both may be women who are sacrificing a lot, but one is doing it from a clear sense of self that exists outside that domain, but is choosing for a period of time to sacrifice some of her other aspects of who she is. And the other person is kind of sacrificing all of themselves as a way of being in the world. So for the first woman, she's going to have a much easier time feeling desire, even in the busyness of young parenthood, because she has a connection to herself outside of that one role. And so she can find herself more in her own skin and in her marriage. The one that kind of stylistically sacrifices all as a way of being what she believes is good is going to have a much harder time even knowing how one would find desire or how one would create erotic energy within herself or in the marriage, because she's sort of folding into everyone else's reality. And that's antithetical to desire usually.
Yeah, this was so interesting when I heard you explain this, because I can see, a time in our marriage in my own life where I think that happened for me. I did choose to, I wanted to be a stay-at-home mom. That is something that I absolutely wanted. And I did that role for 10 years. But I can see, as I have been able to step a little bit more into, maybe just developing myself, beyond just, I don't know, I guess I'll just leave it at that, developing myself and following interests that I have, that it has, I don't know, it's brought so much more to our marriage, to me personally.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so one of the foundational ideas I talk about a lot is that we want to belong to another person. We want to belong to our family. We want to belong to our spouse. but we really want to belong to ourselves, and human beings want both of those things. So oftentimes we are taught that in order to belong to others, we should sacrifice belonging to ourselves. And so when we do that, we kind of kill the life force within ourselves. We undermine our sense of being our own person, the integrity of our own selfhood. And that's a big price to pay, because, if you believe that you just should fold into another life to be a good partner, soon enough, that partnership is full of resentment and full of a feeling of constriction, rather than, okay, how do I attend to and honor who I am while being fair to my role, to my children, or being a good partner? How do I manage that tension between those two realities of being true to myself, but being true to others as well? Mm-hmm. And not that that's easy, sometimes, the tension between those two realities, but it's still an important tension. And oftentimes we will either ask people to yield too much for us, or we will yield too much to others.
And how do you know if you are?
Well, it's a good question, and it's not always clear, because some people who are really asking a lot from everyone are highly tuned in to the few people who don't yield. And then they think, nobody ever gives me what matters to me. But they can't see that they're actually going around demanding a lot. Mm-hmm. I mean, one way to know actually is the simple question of, if I were to ask my child, who gets what they want more, mom or dad, right? What would the child say in an honest moment? The reason I say that way is because in a marriage where it's pretty balanced, you really are attending to the desires and opinions and thoughts of both people. And there's flexibility around it. But if one person is kind of prevailing more, even if they're doing it from a one down position, I have to give up everything. Why do I never get what I want? And that's their way of getting more of what they want, yeah. Right? Then that's kind of how is it imbalanced? And if it's imbalanced in my direction, why is it imbalanced in my direction? If it's imbalanced in my spouse's direction, why? And how do I play a role in that imbalance? Mm-hmm.
Something you said a minute ago, I'd like to dive just deeper for a second. You mentioned that a lot of times when you start having children, there's this understanding that their marriage relationship will now come second. What is your opinion on that? Like, how should it look like ideally?
Well, I think that in the very early months of having a child, that often the sexual relationship takes a bit of a backseat, or at least the marriage relationship shifts when you first have a child. And, the other thing is, when a woman is having a baby, right, and she's carrying that baby inside her body, she's building a relationship to another person, to another role, to another identity. And she's often doing it more than the husband is, because he's not carrying that child inside him. He's often doing much of the same things he was doing before his wife got pregnant. And so there's sometimes a psychological shift that's happening that's very important and really critical for survival. But if the husband resents that, right, and doesn't kind of understand the importance of what's happening, it often, if he competes with that baby, right, or feels jealous of this larger process, that can actually set in motion a kind of reality where the woman starts to build her bond with the children and away from the marriage. I'm not just saying it's all men's fault or anything, because oftentimes women also like the control and being the epicenter that being a mother is. And so they will also sometimes then use having children to back burner the marriage unnecessarily. So while in those first few months, there is a natural back burnering for a small period of time, it's functional. It's not because the children and the relationship with the children is more important than the marriage. It's because there's a job to do when you have a child that is so dependent, but the marriage still works together towards that end, and therefore is able to readily move back into its primary position once the child is getting a tiny bit older.
I think it's so interesting that these things can happen, but it's not a conscious necessary decision. Like I'm jealous of the baby and
right. Exactly.
I don't think it's so valuable being able to step back and hear, examine your life, the things that are running on autopilot and realizing like, oh, there's something here.
Yes.
Okay. So I think we've talked about newlyweds, with children in the home. I'd like to look forward a little bit. What challenges do you see in a marriage, particularly around like connection and sexual fulfillment, when a family or a couple then progresses and they're like empty nesters and they're home alone?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I imagine there's sometimes difficulty there.
Yes. So there's difficulty often on two fronts. One is that, so first of all, raising adolescents is often not easy. Mm-hmm. My husband was just reading an article last night, and he was talking about people's overall level of happiness. And when they have kids in their adolescence, parents' happiness tends to go down. Mm. And when they have empty nesters, their happiness tends to go up. Okay. I have a firm witness of this. Okay. So oftentimes there are issues that are alive in the marriage that get backburnered, as I'm talking about, and they stay backburnered, and the kids become the focus. And then the resentments and the frustration in the marriage kind of gets sidestepped by making children the focus, and whatever challenges the children may be having as the focus. And adolescents can make that especially acute because it's a kind of, you're sort of birthing an adult in mm-hmm. that adolescent period. And it can be uncomfortable for the whole family sometimes. So oftentimes when that ends, that the primary caregiver is often going through some grief in their identity, if they were a full-time caregiver, especially mm-hmm. because they have parented their way out of a role. And so, going back to this idea of belonging to yourself, if your sense of self was really wrapped around your parenting roles, you can often feel at a loss when your children leave. And especially if you've done it in a traditional way, the husband can be at the height of his career and the wife can feel like, I have no career, or I'm mm-hmm. out of an identity. And so that can really be disruptive to a marriage. But that, coupled with the loss of the distraction of the children, can be also where it brings what's going on in the marriage to the fore. And it makes it like there's not a way to not deal with the marriage now. It's just the two of us. And so what have we not been dealing with? And what frustrations have we been holding on to that now need to be examined? So it is a period where many couples divorce, but it's also a period where other couples kind of go through some conflict and some crisis and but choose to deal with things and grow the marriage up. So a lot of couples do go through that, and they get happier as a couple, and they start to enjoy each other, and they go into having better sex, even though they may be menopausal at that point, even though their bodies mm-hmm. may not work as easily as their 25-year-old body worked. But nonetheless, the marriage has, that sometimes people use that to really make the partnership more solid and to sort of reestablish a deeper friendship.
Yeah, I love that thought. Like, I guess our baby is 6, so I still have a little while, but mm-hmm. I think it's helpful to know, like, these are some things to anticipate and look, mm-hmm. Look at. And maybe I should have included a 4th section of the marriage and parenting adolescents, because you're right. I do. My oldest is 15 right now and almost 14. And it does bring a different, it's different. Like our marriage relationship is different. It used to be like, let's put the kids to bed, then we'll have time to connect. And now it's like, you know,
you never go to bed. Yeah.
never go to bed. So we're like, it's harder. It is different.
Yeah. Yep. Mm-hmm.
What, and this is a very big question, but what makes really good sex?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the primary, let me see. What I would say is it's high on, so again, going back to this thing that human beings want, we want to feel connected or a sense of belonging to others, and we want to belong to ourselves. And very similarly, we want security, like a sense of love and belonging, but we also want adventure, and we want kind of the ability to grow and expand and become more ourselves in a way as we grow. So good sex has both of those. There's a basic security to it, like you love me, you know me, you care about me. So really good sex has good sustainable sex, like good sex that is in a long-term marriage, has this quality of truly that it's about loving through your sexuality. So that I love you, you matter to me. You're touching your spouse like they matter, that they're precious to you in a sense, and that you're grateful to have them in your life. And it has a kind of playfulness in it and a kind of adventure in it. So there's passion in it. So it's not just, well, it's Tuesday, we have to, it's my duty, you know. It's not just love. It's also freedom. It's playfulness. It's excitement. It's being willing to reveal aspects of yourself, to be literally intimate, you know, to let your partner in on who you are, to let them in on your erotic mind, and to not use that to say, you have to be my way, or, you know, or you have to do only what makes me comfortable, but you let them in on who you are as a way to find a way to play together. You know, just like kids do, you know, in the sandbox, is that they're coming up with ideas about how to play together and collaborating and cooperating to do that. And that's also really what good sex is that you are creating something that's playful and fun, but also solidifies the security of the partnership.
And if you say I know sometimes you know, you get into a marriage and it's like, oh, we've been doing the same things. Like maybe it's the same dinner, the same, whatever it is, the same, we have sex on Tuesdays or whatever. How would you recommend someone looks at maybe adding more spice or more eroticism to their marriage?
Yeah. Well, one of the big challenges is that we like security. So going back to that idea, and we like predictability. And oftentimes around something as vulnerable as sex or as exposed as sex, we often err in the direction of keeping it safe. So that is, we collude with our spouse in only doing things in the predictable way. So we create boring sex in part because we're afraid to show more of ourselves or even know more of ourselves. So, you know, a question I might ask sometimes is like, what's something you've imagined or thought about doing, but you've never told your spouse about, right? Or what's something that you are curious about, but you've been afraid to name it or say it, right? And it doesn't have to be big or like, you know, these can be small things, but they're just like the revelation of a part of oneself, something that you know, that you, like my husband, I won't say what it is because I don't want to embarrass him on a podcast. I just remember him telling me something, you know, something that like was an idea that really appealed to him when he was like a boy. And it was just like this kind of, you could tell it was like a 9-year-old fantasy, right? It was like at that level, but it was so cute and also turned me on. This idea turned him on, right? So it's like he's revealing this aspect of himself, his younger self, but it's also kind of novel and fun. And it just sort of, you know, I'll play with that idea with him sometimes, right? And so, it's just like sometimes revealing aspects of yourself, as weird as they may be. Like our erotic minds are weird. We like strange things often. The things that turn us on are not usually the, how to say it, the polite aspects they're not the things we say and think in polite company. And so we can be afraid of some of our sexual thoughts. But what can be amazing about a good marriage is you have a place where you can share yourself, that you can play with these ideas, not ever to do anything to undermine the security, again, because we need and want that, but ways to increase the novelty and the creativity and the fun. So it just means, the short answer to your question is just bringing more of yourself, thinking more creatively, trying on new aspects of yourself. My husband and I would like sometimes co-author a sexual story of the two of us that was, like we're different identities in a way, but we're telling a story that we're making up together that kind of appeals to both of us. And just the process of writing it is exciting. I mean, like we were not writing it down necessarily. We were like speaking it out and making sense of it. That is exciting to do it. And then to play it out is exciting. So there's just a lot of ways, if you dare, to understand your sexual self and share it and find common ground. Mm-hmm.
It reminds me of, it was actually at the workshop, a friend that I had come with, she told us how, a friend had told her about this thing that they do called Fantasy Friday. Mm-hmm. And they take turns, like one Friday it's it's the woman's fantasy that she's bringing to sex that night. And then the next it's her husband's. But I liked that idea because it was like, she's like, it forces me to bring myself on that Friday night. Like, and
right.
Whereas otherwise I might not, like, it might just be like the same old.
Right. Well, it takes some courage, so this was a different retreat than the one you were at, but we were talking a lot about sort of what is fantasy and what is, is coming up with meanings that turn us on. And so there was a woman in the audience that had not really done much of this. And during this period, she made a decision. The plan was that she was going to go stay in a hotel that night before she drove the rest of the way home. And so she, as we were talking about all this, got her phone and texted her husband and said, "Hey, I heard your wife is out of town. What would you think about meeting up with me in a hotel tonight, before she gets back tomorrow or whatever?" So she set it up, but she said she was like panicked, like, she knows her husband well, but she's not used to being that playful and that overtly sexual, but she wanted to try it. So this is a perfect way of bringing that novelty. So she sends it off, and then he responds and says, capital YES, yes, I'll be there. And he's like, "This is the best text I've ever gotten from you." And so she shared it with the group, but it was very funny. But that's exactly it. Like she does feel she's going out on a limb. It seems strange. Like, this is the person you have a mortgage with and children with. You'd think this should feel safe, but we're so good at hiding our sexual selves. And it's also just a risk to play that whole thing out and to do this with the person that knows you so well. So, I think, as Esther Perel talks about, it's easier sometimes to bring your sexuality to an affair partner because you can walk away from that relationship, where the person that you share so much of your life with, it can actually be much harder to share and expose these parts of yourself. So the woman at the retreat, she takes this risk, but she's now opened up a whole set of excitement, a whole bunch of possibilities for the two of them that will make them grow closer together. I'm sure of it, that it did.
Yeah.
So
that's cool. I love that story. You've kind of touched on it, but I'm wondering if you'd had anything else to say about, I was reviewing my notes from the workshop talking about how a need for validation equals low intimacy. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. And this is very much David Schnarch's thinking, who wrote the book Passionate Marriage, but he talks a lot about the idea that when we need approval, right, then when we need approval to feel good about ourselves, and a lot of theorists talk about this, that when we're developing our sense of self, when we're younger in our development, resides in other people. We need them to be okay with us for us to be okay with us. Like, I need you to tell me I'm desirable sexually for me to feel okay about myself is one version of it. So when our need for people to approve of us is high, we're going to really limit how much of ourselves we show. We're only going to show the parts that we're already pretty certain they're going to think are okay. And we're going to mask the parts that we don't think they're going to think is okay. So a lot of people say, oh, I love intimacy. I want intimacy. But what they mean is I want to have a person who wants to be close to me, who tells me how great I am. And of course, who doesn't want that, right? But really the definition of intimacy is I'm willing to let you in on who I am, flaws and all, blind spots and all, underdeveloped parts of me. And very few of us want that because it would be inherently invalidating to have someone know where we do stupid things, where we are unkind, where we are underdeveloped. And so we usually in marriage want to be close, but we want to also hide who we are. And so that hiding is often what limits the intimacy development of the marriage.
You use the phrase a sexy self-confronter.
Yeah.
I think, but I love that idea, and I should have you explain it rather than me.
Sure.
But
Sure.
that
Yeah.
big part of that.
Yeah. So self-confronting is this idea of like that you're willing to look honestly at who you are. You're willing to look honestly at your impact. As humans, we're very, very good at tracking, often accurately, the limitations of other people, but we're dumb as doornails about ourselves. Okay. We're very bad usually at tracking who we actually are. Some people actually are bad at tracking in that they think that they are worthless. They think they are, unworthy in a sense, and they're actually not tracking what's real about them. They think they're unattractive and they're wrong. They don't see themselves as they are, but others go up into this, I'm so great. I'm so amazing. When's my spouse going to get it together? It's just amazing. I have to put up with them, and they're misunderstanding their part in the difficulty of the marriage. And so what is really the greatest gift in a marriage is to do that for your spouse, to not just for your spouse, but also for yourself, to be willing to look honestly at who you are and how your limitations impact others negatively, and to self-correct. And so that's very sexy. Okay. That is when you're married to somebody who's willing to look at themselves, when you give them feedback, they think about it seriously and they consider what you're saying and they deal with what is true about themselves. Well, it's very attractive because it's deeply loving, but it's also, this person is invested in your happiness. That is, I don't mean, oh, anything I want, you should do it. Okay. Not that, but that if your spouse, you can imagine if your spouse is doing something that's compromising your happiness, and when you bring it up, they consider it sincerely and address it because they want you to be happy and they want to be a decent person. That's deeply attractive because it's sexy, because it's like, it's safe to be with this person. They're willing to be honest. They're willing to be honest with themselves. They're willing to, they do care about their impact on you. So yeah. So the sexy, we gave out bracelets at the retreat, sexy self-confronter, to just drive it home, because so much of the focus of the retreat is who are you in your marriage and how are you impacting the sexual dynamic? Mm-hmm.
So another takeaway I would love for you to touch on that I had from the workshop retreat was, these were just like, you were speaking and I was just writing. So clarify if I'm misquoting, but basically you said men, they would say that nothing turns me on more than to see her turned on. Speaking of their partner, men want to be received. That is a turn on. Not rejection or uncertainty. And women, they say the turn on is to be the turn on, to believe in your own desirability. That's the biggest aphrodisiac. Don't hide your arousal.
That's right. Yes. So this is a Esther Perel idea that, yes, that women, our sexuality is a little bit narcissistic in that the feminine position, right? Which is the more submissive position. I don't mean it's the female position. I'm saying it more from a dynamic frame of yin and yang or feminine, masculine. But the feminine likes to be the turn on, likes to be desired, likes to be found attractive, to be the one to attract towards her. And so women often, when I'm talking to women about their sexual fantasies, that they're the one that's desired among other options, that they're the one that turns the guy on, that arouses him. And so a lot of women who've been taught the narrative that to be a good woman is to be circumspect and to be modest and to be careful and all that, will often perhaps want that, but be afraid of that, afraid of the self-respect in it, actually, afraid of the feeling good about themselves. But it's super attractive to men when a woman feels good about herself, owns her attractiveness, and lets him worship that attractiveness in a way, and for her to receive it. So it's a turn on for her to be the turn on. And then, of course, men are attracted to that, but also they like to know they're received. I think men receive a lot of messaging that that their sexuality is perpetrative inherently, that their sexuality is offensive. And so good men that don't want to do harm with their sexuality, to actually be received, to say, you are desirable to me. Like, I'm desirable, woman, but I receive you. I want you. That's highly arousing and validating. And so that's often the core dynamic of a good yin and yang. I talk about this too, just sort of what is the dynamic of desire. And it's often this actor and acted upon, desirer and desired, that kind of thing. So that's often a core dynamic of masculine, feminine energy.
I'm thinking, so just going back to my own experience, there were a lot of years where, I did feel tired, like with the babies, and it would be like,
Sure.
And maybe that's was my excuse about it. But it's like, there was a time where being told like, I'm too tired tonight, like often enough, it creates like, well, I'm not desired. Like maybe like Chris and I had conversations him thinking like, well, I don't think you desire me anymore. Like, I feel like undesirable. What would you say? Yeah. Where would you go from there?
Well, one thing that I have found in talking to a lot of women, and this may not always be the case, of course, because it can be exhausting when you're up all night, and, to make time for sex can be challenging. But one of the core things that I have seen in working with women is that women so often experience sex not as a place of being taken care of, but another person to take care of. So they've taken care of kids all day, and then they need to take care of their spouse on some level. And it's not enough in the opposite direction, which is, this is my time to be taken care of by my spouse, right? To be given pleasure, to be able to surrender to that desire, that affection, that arousal. And I think it's a big shift in how a lot of women think. And so, to be honest, when I was raising kids, it was intense. I have a special needs child. It was a lot. But for me, sex was so much that meaning that I made time for it, not for my husband's needs, but for my needs. Because it was a time for me to be able to be given to be cared for, to sort of reconnect with my husband. And because that was a source of strength for me to do the harder work of raising the kids during the day.
Yeah, I love that. And I could see, at the time I wasn't looking at it like that. It was more like, I've been nursing this baby all day.
Yeah.
It's like,
right.
Attending to all of these things. And it was just like another need, I guess, that I felt like was to be filled, and not looking at it like, what are we going to create together? Like, to make. like a beautiful connection.
And I think the other piece of that can sometimes be not feeling attractive during that period. You know, you're nursing, you feel like you're leaking everywhere. You're just like, you know, your baby spit up on you. It's very hard to feel sexy. And I totally understand it. I think honestly, it gets a lot easier once you're out of that early stage of parenting. But I remember my sister, I was like 9 months pregnant, and I was talking to my sister about the fact that having intercourse like was my plan for getting the baby to come. And she's like, I do not understand how you could possibly get turned on, basically looking like you look. And so I just said, listen, I just fantasize that I'm skinny. And she's like, wow, that is like some imagination you have. So, but that I would often, like, no matter what I actually look like, I would just imagine like, okay, just channel my sexy self, even if it's under a lot of, you know, I don't know, under a lot of roles post-pregnancy and so on. Just channel that part of me that knows that I am attractive, like that I am a worthy and desirable person. So I think that helps too, if you can give yourself permission to just step into it and not go into that sort of self-critical lens either.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Mm-hmm.
If you're listening to this episode and you realize like, oh, I do want to level up in this area. What, of course, I mentioned earlier your courses. You have a strengthening your relationship course, enhancing sexual intimacy, the art of desire for women, which I attended, art of loving. You also, part of me wanted to have you on to talk about how to talk to your kids about sex, because we talk a lot about parenting, and I know that you have an awesome course about that too. But is there any other places you would recommend someone could go if they're wanting to really look at this and make some changes?
Yeah. So there's the online courses, and then I also have a podcast. It's a subscription podcast called Room for Two, in which I'm working with couples around marital and sexual issues. So they're talking about the challenges they're facing around desire and that kind of thing. And I'm giving my input on, you know, what I think is happening in the marriage and what they can each do. And a lot of people, that's $97 for the year. A lot of people find that to be very helpful for being able to, at a low cost, to be able to look at their marriage and see themselves in other people, which both is normalizing, but it also helps them to see themselves and say, okay, that's like us. We do that. Yeah. And it gives you some idea about what you need to do differently to change the pattern.
Yeah. And I subscribe to that as well. And I have really enjoyed it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's great.
Is there any other like foundational books or, just books, I guess you would recommend?
Yeah. Well, I would recommend any of David Schnarch's books. Passionate Marriage, Intimacy and Desire are two that are very good. For women, Come As You Are is a good book. I can't say her name right now. Give me 1 second. I'll think of it.
I actually just started listening to this on Audible based on, you know, the discussion at the retreat.
You have the author's name. It's Emily Nagoski. Is that what it is?
Yeah.
It just came to me. Yeah, I think it's Emily.
Yes.
Emily Nagoski, Come As You Are. I feel like there's another one, but I can't think of it right now. So I would suggest those.
Yeah, those
are
good.
all good. Yeah.
Any the final thoughts for a couple listening who is wanting to look at enhancing their connection or their sexual intimacy?
Well, I would say two things. Like, the first is that it's a worthwhile pursuit. And this is not produce the sex so the higher desire partner in the marriage isn't miserable. That's not the right idea. It's how do we create something that feels like both a place of coming home and a place of expansion? Like, how do we create sex worth wanting? What are we each doing that's interfering? How are we each not participating in a way that's creating something stronger and better? The other thing I would say is that this is also a Schnarch idea, that the challenges that you are facing in your marriage and in your sexual, I'll say it differently. The challenges in your sexual relationship are often a microcosm of some of the larger challenges in the marriage. So often they reveal where you as a couple are limited. And I don't mean that in a kind of judging way. I'm saying that it shows the areas that you need to grow. So using the challenge of the sexual relationship to grow yourself up, to see where you can be a limited person, right, can help not just your sexual relationship, but it can help every aspect of the marriage. And, really becoming someone more capable of love and desire.
Could you, on the spot, I'm like, I love that idea. Can you think of an example of what that might look like for a couple, of using that microcosm? So,
for example, this just in my mind, because I just worked with this couple today. She handles her anxiety in life by yielding to other people. I'll do what you want, just be happy with me. It's what she grew up learning to do. And she just intuitively does it, but then she feels resentful because she's disappearing. So sex for a long time was just kind of accommodating her husband. The husband handles his anxiety by getting people to do what he wants, right? So he's always like coming up with ideas that the wife then fears, because she's afraid that those ideas are now going to become the new dictates of her life. And so so one of his presenting concerns was she was anxious in sex, that she didn't ever want to surrender to him, and that it didn't feel passionate enough. Well, the sexual relationship was showing the way that this dynamic played out, not just in sex, but in the whole marriage, where he would be blind to his own form of taking, because he'd put it in the frame that I know what would make our sexual relationship better. I know what would make our marriage better. I know what you need to do. And she would just intuitively kind of do it. And so that was the pattern that needed to be broken. And so it's in seeing it in sex, seeing it outside of sex, and for him to wake up to the fact that he handles his anxiety through a kind of taking that he goes blind to, calls it just standing up for good. And she handles her anxiety by just sort of accommodating and yielding to get the conflict to go away, get his anger to go away, but then feeling like there's no room for her in the marriage or the sexual relationship, therefore never wanting to surrender to his desire. She's always anxious when she's with him because he's a hard person to settle down with. So it's helping him see this. She already owns, yes, I'm weak, and that's easy for her to see. And she needs to step up and kind of claim her own mind. On his side, it's harder because it's masked in his mind as strength, when in fact it's a kind of taking and it's limitation. So it's just it's a way of seeing it and then changing it. And then what happens in couples is that, and I've seen, this is just one version, but I see this pattern in a lot of couples, so that as people self-confront, stop that pattern, don't handle their anxiety by pressuring the other person, well, they become easier to be close to. They become easier to actually, collaborate with, because you feel like when I talk about my idea, you don't just shut it down because it's not your idea. And so then it becomes easier to be present and to be open and to be playful, right? Think how hard it is to be playful in a dynamic where you feel like you have to yield to the other person to keep them happy. There is no play.
Totally.
It's just duty. So, so that's an example of one dynamic, and that I've worked with many couples who do that precise one, that grow into more collaborative marriages and sexual relationships.
Yeah, that was helpful to be able to see, how that one glimpse is actually bigger.
Yeah.
Okay, I do have one last question. It's something I wanted to touch on, and I hope it doesn't feel forced right here, but you talked a lot at the beginning of your workshop about how, talking about human development, how it's desirable for us to become self-authoring.
Yes.
And I'd maybe like to kind of end with that thought, like, what does just this idea of, we talk about this in Family Brand a lot, like becoming the family that you want to be, defining who you want to be.
Mhm.
But at your workshop, it hit me, I guess, for the first time around self-authoring,
Mhm.
like in a marriage specifically, like a sexual partnership. Can
Yes.
you maybe just talk a little bit
Yeah.
about that idea?
So just going back to this idea of playfulness and freedom, or to go back to that couple, let me say it like this first. If it's not in you, you're going to feel trapped by your need for approval. So the developmental idea is when we're first born, our sense of self is in others. We aren't yet able to hold a sense of self independent of what other people tell us about ourselves. But in marriage, going back to the couple I just talked about, for example, each of them, when they're in their more limited place, their sense of self resides in the other. So she's trying to yield to his mind in order to get the picture from him that she's the right kind of wife. But when she does it, she feels like maybe she belongs to him, but she loses her sense of self. And he tries to get a sense of self by getting her to yield, by validating that he's desirable, and puts pressure on her when she doesn't, because that's his way of saying, it's not me that's the problem, it's you. So that's his limitation. For them to grow up is to say, I've got, for him to say, I'm unfair. I take too much. I extract from my wife in the name of strength. That's to move from an external to an internal reference. That's not the man I want to be. I want to be better. So he's going from, you tell me that I'm good, to I have to do what I need to, so that I know that I'm being good and fair. For her, it would be not trying to get everybody to tell her she's okay by yielding to them, but being willing to stand up for and claim her own mind. So that's how, when couples move into a deeper self-authoring, there is more freedom in the marriage and more ability to be close. It's like a little bit paradoxical. You can be both closer and feel more deeply yourself. And that's what happens as you start to genuinely self-author in your life.
That's beautiful. Thank you. I really appreciate you being here today and sharing with us your wisdom and knowledge. And I will put all the links to connect with Jennifer Finlayson Fife and her work. I've really benefited from it personally. And thank you for your time today and sharing with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.